American Civil War, Battle of Perryville, Kentucky's crucial conflict. On October 7, 1862, as the Union Army of the Ohio settles in for the night a few miles from the Confederate-held town of Perryville, four comrades, Federal Generals Philip Sheridan, James Jackson, William Terrell, and Colonel George Webster, convene around a campfire to enjoy each other's company. During their lighthearted exchanges, the subjects of mortality and warfare emerge in their discussion. With a sense of assurance, Terrell expresses his belief in his survival, asserting that the likelihood of his death is minimal. He even goes so far as to suggest that the chance of all four of them perishing in the same battle is nearly impossible. Convinced that fate is on their side, the four men exchange goodbyes and retire to their tents, optimistic about reuniting at sunset the next day. As both armies attempt to rest before the impending conflict, only time will reveal whether Terrell's optimistic prediction holds true. On October 1, 1862, Major General Don Carlos Buell leads the reinforced Ohio Army out of its fortifications in Louisville, eager for combat. After nearly 2 months of pursuing Bragg through Kentucky and Tennessee, the Federal forces are eager for an impending battle. In accordance with Buell's strategy, Brigadier General Joshua W. Sill directs his division towards Frankfort to distract Bragg from the main offensive. This main offensive comprises the bulk of Buell's forces, including the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Corps, which are directed towards Bragg's reported location at Bardstown. Major General Alexander M. McCook's 1st Corps takes the northern route via the Taylorsville Pike. Meanwhile, Major General Thomas L. Crittenden's 2nd Corps, accompanied by Buell's second in command, Major General George H. Thomas, follows the direct route along the Bardstown Pike. Lastly, Major General Charles C. Gilbert's 3rd Corps takes the southern route on the Shepherdsville Pike. Buell's objective is for all three corps to converge on Bragg simultaneously, thereby overwhelming the Confederate forces with superior numbers. On October 2nd, while Generals Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirby Smith strategize their next steps in the Kentucky campaign, an unexpected report reaches them. It indicates that Buell has abandoned the security of Louisville and is advancing directly towards the Confederates in Frankfort. Consequently, Bragg discards any prior plans he had formulated. Recognizing the imminent threat of battle, Bragg swiftly issues commands for Hardee and Polk to mobilize their corps northward to flank Buell's army as it engages Smith. However, Bragg is unaware that this contingent constitutes merely a fraction of Buell's forces. Misjudging Buell's actual strategy, Bragg instructs his troops at Versailles to prepare for a counterattack against what he anticipates will be an assault on Smith, envisioning a confrontation reminiscent of Lee's remarkable triumph at Second Manassas. Just as the prospect of a significant battle looms, Bragg shifts his focus to the appointment of Richard Halls as governor instead. While Bragg assembles his forces for the impending conflict near Frankfort, he receives alarming updates from Polk. Despite clear signs that the Federals are gathering for an offensive on Frankfort, Bragg is met with ambiguous reports from his subordinates regarding a substantial Union presence developing at the rear of the army near Bardstown. Taken aback by the unexpected strength on his flanks, Polk disregards Bragg's orders to regroup at Versailles and instead directs the army eastward towards Perryville. Meanwhile, Bragg proceeds with the inauguration of Richard Halls as the Confederate governor of Kentucky. Despite the rain on October 4th, the ceremony continues as planned. As Halls and several prominent Kentucky secessionists deliver their speeches, couriers arrive with news of Sill's Federals advancing just a few miles away. With no troops available, Bragg and the other Confederate leaders abandon the capital. The arrival of Sill's forces reinforces Bragg's belief that Buell's objective is Frankfort. Once they are out of danger, Bragg instructs all Confederate units to regroup at Harrodsburg, where he aims to consolidate his forces and confront Sill's Federals. However, when orders are issued, Polk and Hardee proceed towards Harrodsburg, while Smith does not follow suit. Concerned about Sill's Federals advancing on Lexington, Smith only moves as far as the Kentucky River. With Smith's refusal to comply and his reluctance to assert authority, Bragg abandons his plan for Harrodsburg and directs the Army of Mississippi to regroup with Smith. Meanwhile, Polk receives intelligence suggesting that the force trailing him is not substantial, presenting an opportunity to defeat this isolated contingent. Consequently, Polk commands Major General James P. Anderson and his division to join Hardee in Perryville to assess the enemy's strength and engage if feasible. On the morning of October 7th, Hardee swiftly organizes his defenses to confront his pursuers. With only Major General Simon B. Buckner's division available, Hardee arranges the brigades on elevated terrain to obstruct the main routes into Perryville. He plans to maintain this position until Polk's reinforcements arrive to bolster his defenses. Positioned in the center of Hardee's line is Little's brigade of veteran Arkansans, which has been advanced to Bottom Hill, overlooking the vital water source at Doctors Creek. Although Bottom Hill offers a strong defensive position, Liddell is apprehensive about Peters Hill to the west, which could easily overshadow his troops. Fearing that the Federals might exploit this advantage, he sends the 7th Arkansas to secure the heights. To the west, Buell's 3rd Corps is making its way toward Perryville. Positioned on the left flank of the Army is McCook's Warnkorps, which is progressing along the McVille Road. In the center, Gilbert's 3rd Corps is advancing on the Springfield Pike. Crittenden's 2nd Corps is positioned on the Lebanon Pike. As Gilbert's corps moves eastward, they encounter Confederate cavalry led by Colonel Joseph Wheeler, who attempts to halt their progress toward no avail. By the evening of October 7th, Gilbert's 3rd Corps finds itself the nearest to Perryville, establishing camp approximately 3 miles from the town. Buell, who is accompanying Gilbert, sets up his headquarters in a log cabin owned by John Dorsey, situated about 5 miles from Perryville. Anticipating the arrival of his entire army shortly, Buell intends to launch an attack on the Confederates the following day before they can retreat. He instructs McCook and Crittenden to position their corps alongside Gilbert by 8 a.m. Once all 3 corps are assembled, they will initiate the attack. After nearly a week of marching in sweltering conditions, the weary Federals are in urgent need of water. Despite this scarcity, Buell has Bragg's army within his reach. All that remains is to wait until the next day to strike, and the troublesome Confederates, who have been causing chaos throughout Kentucky, will be defeated. As the clock strikes midnight on October 8, 1862, Federal scouts from Gilbert's 3rd Corps are dispatched to find water to replenish their canteens. During their search, they discover the shallow pools of Doctors Creek, shimmering under the moonlight. As they approach, they discover Liddell's Arkansans stationed on Peters Hill, safeguarding this valuable resource. Recognizing that a mere handful of men will not suffice to seize the remaining water, Gilbert instructs Brigadier General Philip Sheridan to select one of his brigades for the task. Sheridan opts for Colonel Dan McCook's Green Brigade from Illinois to undertake the mission of capturing Peters Hill. McCook, understandably apprehensive about launching a nighttime assault with inexperienced troops, advances stealthily towards the unsuspecting Confederate forces. As the inexperienced Illinoisans reach the summit, the 7th Arkansas illuminates the night by firing into the advancing Federal ranks. Despite their efforts, Little's Arkansans are unable to withstand McCook's assault and are compelled to retreat from Peters Hill. Refusing to concede defeat, Little commands a counteroffensive. However, he lacks the manpower to gain an advantage over McCook and is ultimately forced to withdraw. Following the unexpected early morning skirmish, both McCook and Liddell express concern about confronting larger forces and decide to fortify their positions while awaiting reinforcements. At 7 a.m., in an effort to maintain momentum, Gilbert dispatches Gay's cavalry brigade to clear the woods in front of McCook's position. Gay, who is far from enthusiastic about his orders, charges into the woods but is easily repelled, suffering significant losses among his troopers. Realizing that the rebels are in a more precarious situation than initially anticipated, Sheridan ultimately resolves to deploy Leiboldt's Pea Ridge veterans into the fray. Leiboldt's German troops advance and launch a fierce assault on Little's line, driving back the Arkansans. Unable to endure this onslaught without additional support, Polk decides to withdraw Liddell's brigade to the main Confederate line. By 10 a.m., with Sheridan's Federals now in control of Peters Hill and the Confederates retreating to Perryville, neither side attempts to rekindle the morning conflict. During the lull, Polk inspects the lines and is alarmed by the sight of a substantial Federal force occupying the high ground just beyond the Chaplin River. Observing the situation, Polk declines to engage with the unidentified force he estimates to outnumber his troops of 18,000 by a ratio of 3-1. In defiance of Bragg's orders to launch an attack, the bishop opts for a defensive strategy, planning to initiate an offensive only if circumstances become favorable. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the Chaplin River, Gilbert Rains and his subordinates await the anticipated arrival of McCook's and Crittenden's corps on their flanks. Shortly thereafter, the vanguard from McCook's First Corps arrives and positions itself near the Dixville Crossroads just north of Gilbert's location, albeit 2 hours later than scheduled. As McCook's forces settle in, they find no indication of the expected rebels and assume they have missed the engagement. Nevertheless, they take advantage of the delay to rest after their early morning march. Further to the south, Crittenden's corps is conspicuously absent. Thomas, who is effectively in command, permits his men to rest further, which exacerbates the delays in Buell's schedule. As the troops of Crittenden's Second Corps approach within a few miles of Perryville, they encounter additional Confederate cavalry. Despite the strong resistance from the rebel cavalry, the initial units of the Second Corps finally arrive around 11 a.m. Upon their arrival, Thomas sends word that his forces have reached their assigned position at Buell. The commanding general expresses considerable dissatisfaction regarding the delays caused by his two flanking corps. Buell ultimately determines that he lacks sufficient time to launch an attack on the 8th with the overwhelming force he has prepared, leading him to postpone the offensive until the following morning. With no imminent confrontation and the rebels absent, the Federal troops fall into a state of complacency, taking the opportunity to rest while the trailing brigades make their way to the front lines. Due to the strained command structure affecting the entire Army of the Ohio, the initiative gained earlier in the day is now shifting to the Confederates as the sun reaches its peak. The issue of a weak command chain is not exclusive to the Federal Army. The Confederates are also grappling with communication breakdowns between Bragg and his subordinates on October 8th. Despite the intense skirmishing throughout the morning, neither Polk nor Hardee provides Bragg with an accurate assessment of the developing situation to the west of Perryville. Consequently, Bragg remains under the impression that the primary Federal threat is directed towards Frankfort, influenced by a continuous stream of urgent messages from Smith. Eager to consolidate his forces, Bragg requires Polk to eliminate his Federal contingent and hasten north to join Smith's troops. However, as the sun ascends higher, the sounds of battle remain conspicuously absent from Perryville. Troubled by the silence and the ambiguous reports from his subordinates, Bragg resolves to ride to Perryville to evaluate the situation personally. Upon his arrival at the front, Bragg is incensed by what he discovers. Rather than encountering an active assault, he finds his men idly resting around the town. Frustrated by the delays, Bragg commands an immediate attack against the unidentified Federal forces positioned in front of them. As Bragg assesses Polk's positioning, he becomes increasingly dismayed to discover that Polk has neglected to establish his battle line at any advantageous location. Consequently, due to Polk's blatant disregard for his directives, the absence of an ongoing battle, and his intention to coordinate with Smith, Bragg sets about rectifying the mistakes made by his subordinates in preparation for the forthcoming assault. To address the deficiencies in his battle line, Bragg issues 2 coordinated but time-intensive maneuvers at 11 a.m. The initial maneuver involves Hardee's 2 divisions, led by Anderson and Buckner, crossing the arid bed of the Chaplin River to advance toward the enemy. Concurrently, Major General Franklin B. Cheatham's division from Polk's wing will withdraw from the line and march 2 miles north to bridge the gap between Hardee's wing and Walker's Bend. Once Bragg has positioned his forces, a 30-minute artillery bombardment will precede the infantry attack scheduled for 12:30 p.m. Following the bombardment, the Confederate infantry will launch an attack in echelon from right to left, beginning with Cheatham's division, with the aim of flanking and dismantling the Federal left. As Cheatham's assault commences, Hardee will direct his troops into the fray to decisively defeat the Federal forces. Despite his efforts to reinforce his line in preparation for the attack, Bragg remains unaware that Crittenden's 2nd Corps is approaching from the south. Thus, while the North Carolinian organizes his formations, he is focused on deploying all his units to confront the 2 Federal corps currently positioned in front of him, without any reserves to counter a potential surprise attack on his flanks. Once Bragg's orders are issued, the various units begin to advance, with Hardee's 2 divisions moving closer to the enemy. On the far left flank of Hardee's position, Powell loses sight of the neighboring brigades amidst the undulating hills, finding himself isolated against the Federal center. Cheatham's division advances effectively in their northern march, positioning themselves in the crucial gap identified by Bragg. As they progress, they stir up clouds of dust, which many Federals mistakenly interpret as a sign of retreat, leading them to lower their defenses further. As the clock approaches 12:30 p.m., the Confederates prepare for combat, while their Federal counterparts, nearly convinced of a rebel withdrawal, relax under the warm October sun. When the clock strikes 12:30 p.m., Confederate artillery along the entire front unleashes a barrage on the unsuspecting Federals stationed atop Bottom Hill. Taken by surprise, these Federals drop to the ground to evade the incoming shells. An observer from Rousseau's division described the scene as a continuous roar of cannons mixed with the screeching of shells and whistling projectiles, creating a chaos of discord and fear. Realizing that their adversaries have not retreated, the Federal artillerymen respond with their own fire. Utilizing their superior artillery, the Federals quickly gain the advantage, inflicting severe damage on the outmatched Confederate batteries. As the bombardment subsides, McCook anticipates an imminent infantry assault following the artillery strike. With this in mind, he organizes his corps into a battle line. Observing his troops as they take their positions, he becomes aware that his left flank is vulnerable. To address this issue, he commands Terrell's Green Brigade of Western troops to occupy the open knoll, precisely where Bragg intends to exploit the Federal left flank. Observing the movement of Federal columns toward the hill, Polk once again opts to postpone the attack, much to Bragg's frustration. After an additional hour of waiting, during which no further concealed columns pose a threat to his advance, Polk finally directs his wing to engage the Federal left flank at 2 p.m. The initial assault is led by Donaldson's Brigade of Tennessee Veterans. Upon receiving their orders, the troops unleash a rebel yell and advance. They confront a challenging landscape of hills, valleys, and tree lines that separate the 2 armies. However, as the Confederates press forward, Bragg's strategy to flank the Federals begins to falter when Donaldson's men ascend the final ridge before encountering the enemy. Instead of striking the Federal flank, Donaldson's forces find themselves attacking the front lines of Jackson's division. Anticipating such an assault, Terrell's troops, supported by artillery, effectively repel the advancing Confederates. Despite the chaos caused by the Hellblade artillery fire, Donaldson's men continue their advance, yet the Federals steadfastly maintain their position on the hill. Joseph Gleason, a soldier from Indiana in Terrell's unit, noted that our bullets found them in their hiding places and strewn the ground with their mutilated carcasses. Unable to overcome Terrell's inexperienced recruits, Donaldson's men are forced to retreat after sustaining heavy losses. In response to this unforeseen challenge, Cheatham persists with his echelon attack while also dispatching Maney's Tennesseans to execute a flanking maneuver on the right. This unexpected assault catches the Federals on the left flank off guard, as Maney's troops unleash devastating volleys against the beleaguered Bluecoats. During one of these volleys, Jackson is struck and killed by a bullet to the chest. Witnessing the Federal lines falter, Maney's men charge up the hill alongside Stuart's fresh brigade of Tennesseans. Unable to withstand this renewed offensive, Terrell's forces abandon the open knob at 3:30 p.m. As the battle intensifies on the Army's left flank, Buell, nursing a headache at his headquarters, faintly hears distant cannon fire. This muted sound is a result of an acoustic shadow, a phenomenon that similarly affected Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston during the Battle of Seven Pines. With only a slight noise emanating from the front lines, Buell dismisses the cannon fire as yet another artillery exchange, akin to previous encounters. Frustrated, the commanding general instructs Gilbert to cease the firing. In response, Gilbert directs Sheridan, whom he suspects to be responsible, to hold his fire, leaving Sheridan perplexed. While Buell remains oblivious to the ongoing conflict, Bragg observes with unabashed pride as Cheatham's division launches an assault on the Federal left flank. However, as Bragg commits his limited forces against only a segment of the enemy, he remains painfully unaware of the looming threat approaching his left flank. His cavalry has failed to adequately inform him of this danger or to impede its advance along the Lebanon Pike. Consequently, as Bragg continues his offensive maneuvers, he remains blissfully ignorant of the approaching corps led by Thomas. At the front, despite Cheatham's brigades successfully breaking Terrell's hold on the elevated position, communication within the Confederate ranks begins to deteriorate. Without waiting for orders, Jones's brigade, comprised of inadequately equipped Mississippians, initiates an attack on the right flank of Rousseau's division, which is positioned near Squire Bottom's house. Occupying the advantageous position, Harris's Ohioans easily repel the outmatched rebels. As Jones' brigade initiates the assault, Buckner perceives an opportunity to launch his own offensive and deploys his two brigades against Lytle's forces, comprised of troops from Ohio and Indiana. Johnson's brigade, consisting of Tennesseans, engages in the battle. However, a mix of friendly fire and disarray causes their advance to falter. Observing the halt in Johnson's attack, Buckner quickly sends in Adams' brigade of Louisiana veterans to provide assistance. With the arrival of the Louisianans, Lytle finds his brigade caught between two converging rebel offensives, while Harris confronts a new challenge as Brown's fresh brigade of Floridians intensifies the conflict. After an hour of relentless gunfire, both sides exhaust their ammunition. Determined to maintain their hard-won territory, each side calls for reinforcements. The situation has now turned into a race to see which side will receive support first in the struggle for Squire Bottom's house. In search of assistance, Johnson requests Cleburne's seasoned Arkansas and Tennessee brigade to help break the deadlock over the house. Upon receiving the call, Cleburne crosses Doctors Creek and ascends the hill. This new threat proves overwhelming for Lytle's beleaguered brigade, leading to its collapse. During the retreat, Lytle sustains a head injury while attempting to rally his men, who ultimately abandon him in the chaos. Conversely, Harris remains resolute in holding his position. Frustrated by Harris's unwavering resolve, Buckner sends forth his final fresh brigade, Wood's substantial brigade of Alabama and Mississippi veterans, to bridge the gap between Brown and Stuart. Unable to withstand this new onslaught, Harris decides to withdraw his forces before they face annihilation. By 4:30 p.m., with Jackson's division in disarray and Russo's division in full retreat, McCook witnesses the disintegration of his corps. In a state of panic, McCook requests assistance from Gilbert's nearby 3rd Corps, only to be met with disbelief as no one offers to help. Sheridan, positioned closest to McCook's course, anxiously anticipates an attack on his own forces. Despite the absence of support from the 3rd Corps, McCook inexplicably neglects to inform Buell about the critical nature of the situation. As a result, Buell remains unaware of the intense battle unfolding on his left flank. Meanwhile, Sheridan's 2nd Corps stands ready to ambush Bragg, yet without directives from Buell, the soldiers remain inactive while their fellow troops in McCook's 1st Corps struggle for survival. Although Terrell's inexperienced recruits have finally succumbed under relentless pressure, the Confederates now face Starkweather's newly arrived brigade of Wisconsinites. Despite suffering significant losses in their initial engagement, the Confederates press forward with renewed determination. This new offensive is spearheaded by Brigadier General Alexander P. Stewart, affectionately known as Old Strait by his troops, while the rest of Cheatham's division follows closely behind. Once the Confederates reach point-blank range, Starkweather's men deliver a devastating volley that temporarily halts their advance. Nevertheless, the Confederates regroup and charge at the Federal defenders. A fierce melee erupts in the cornfield, with both sides vigorously battling one another. Overwhelmed by the Confederate assault, the inexperienced soldiers of Starkweather's brigade succumb to the pressures of combat and retreat from the battlefield. As turmoil envelops the Federal left flank, Terrell becomes aware that no one has taken command of Jackson's division. Just as he dons his division cap, a shell fragment strikes him in the chest, resulting in his immediate death. Upon learning of Terrell's demise, Colonel Webster takes command of Jackson's division and organizes the disheartened remnants behind a stone wall near the Widow Gibson house. Once the Confederates regain their composure, Manning and Stuart launch their weakened forces against this newly established defensive position. The formidable natural defenses prove overwhelming for the rebels, who are repelled with significant losses. Manning and Stuart make 2 additional attempts to seize the position, but ultimately recognize the futility of capturing the wall. After being thwarted by the Federals, Manning and Stuart withdraw their battered troops. Resigning themselves to the impossibility of reaching the Dixville crossroads, their brigades pay a heavy price for their efforts, yet their attempts remain fruitless as they fail to secure the crucial crossroads. The Federals also endure substantial losses, with many of Jackson's brigades suffering nearly 50% casualties. Although Jackson's forces manage to halt the relentless advance of the rebels, fighting reignites to the south as Buckner's troops renew their assault on Russo's retreating division as the sun begins to set. Following the retreating Federals, Cleburne spearheads a renewed offensive against McCook's right flank. Encountering Lytle's disorganized brigade further down the road, the Confederates advance and inflict severe damage with precise rifle fire. James Shanklin, a soldier in the 42nd Indiana, recounted, "The piercing screams, the terrifying, frenzied cries of the bombs whistling past us, and the snake-like hissing of bullets made that march the most captivating journey I have ever experienced." Unable to endure the mounting pressure, the remnants of Lytle's brigade retreat once more. With Lytle's command diminished, Cleburne positions himself a mere 100 yards from the Dixville crossroads. Noticing a gap on his right flank, McCook instructs Webster to advance his predominantly Ohio brigade to occupy the space created by Harris. Despite forming a solid blue front, these inexperienced soldiers stand little chance against Adams's seasoned veterans. As the Confederates close in, they decimate Webster's troops, including Colonel Webster himself, who suffers mortal wounds during the engagement. With Webster's death, 3 out of the 4 men whom Terrell had predicted would survive the battle are now deceased. Only Sheridan, positioned within Gilbert's 3rd Corps, remains alive. As the sun rapidly descends and the Confederate lines advance, it remains uncertain whether Sheridan will escape Perryville unscathed. Meanwhile, to Webster's right, Rousseau establishes an improvised line near the Russell House to confront Cleburne's slender yet triumphant regiments. After enduring hours of uphill marches and breaking through multiple lines, Cleburne's forces find themselves at their limit. Upon reaching Rousseau's position, they are met with a devastating point-blank volley and are forced to retreat. Acknowledging that his men can advance no further, he withdraws them to Squire Bottom's house. Although the Confederates have achieved some victories thus far, their time is running short. If they fail to breach McCook's beleaguered I Corps and reach the Dixville crossroads before nightfall, they will forfeit their opportunity to annihilate an entire Federal Corps. Despite having gained a brief reprieve after repelling Cleburne, many members of McCook's I Corps are anxiously awaiting the arrival of darkness, with Rousseau even lamenting, "Will that sun never go down?" Meanwhile, to the south, the threat that Sheridan has anticipated all day finally emerges as Powell's solitary brigade advances to silence one of his artillery units. Upon spotting these rebels, Sheridan assumes they represent the forefront of a significant new offensive. However, due to the undulating landscape, he is unaware that it is merely a single brigade. Consequently, Sheridan declines to provide any assistance to McCook. As Powell's troops approach, they unleash the rebel yell and charge forward. But as they come within range of Sheridan's division, they realize their error. Similar to Sheridan, Powell is unaware that the battery is backed by an entire division. Nevertheless, Powell's Confederates put up a valiant fight, but ultimately retreat in the face of insurmountable odds. During this skirmish, Sheridan calls upon Mitchell to bolster his precarious position. True to his word, Mitchell sends Carlin's brigade of Westerners to pursue Powell's retreating forces. The Federals chase Powell all the way to the outskirts of Perryville. Observing Carlin's advance, Mitchell recognizes an opportunity to capture the town and sever Bragg's line of retreat. With Crittenden's 2nd Corps nearby, ready to provide support, Mitchell is poised to seize Perryville from the distracted Confederates. However, he overlooks one critical factor, his Corps commander, Major General Charles T. Gilbert. The darkness that had shrouded the Federal headquarters at Perryville is finally dispelled when Sheridan successfully repels Powell's solitary assault. The sounds of combat ultimately rouse Buell and Gilbert from their previous unawareness. Upon hearing these noises, Buell instructs Gilbert to proceed to the front lines to ascertain the situation. Upon joining Sheridan, Gilbert learns of McCook's imminent collapse. Realizing the gravity of the circumstances, Gilbert commands 2 brigades to assist McCook in his critical struggle for the crossroads. He reallocates these brigades from Mitchell's division and directs the assertive general to rejoin Sheridan, much to his displeasure. Gilbert issues these orders just as Polk launches one final, desperate assault for the Dixville crossroads in the dimming light. While the Federal forces are rearranging their formations to reinforce McCook's position, the Confederates are preparing to make a decisive breakthrough and seize the crucial crossroads. Although many Confederate brigades are rendered ineffective, a few remain engaged in the battle. Adams and the Louisianans, among others, press forward, hoping to penetrate McCook's vulnerable line. However, as they approach the Blue Line, they are not only met with frontal assaults, but also face devastating fire from Sheridan's artillery stationed on Peters Hill. Taken aback, Adams abruptly halts his advance and withdraws. With Adams' brigade no longer in the fray, who remains to challenge McCook's line? As they advance, these soldiers anticipate encountering the Federals in a weakened state. Instead, Gooding's newly arrived brigade of Illinois troops from the 3rd Corps intervenes to halt the rebel advance. As the sky darkens, Gooding's forces charge at Wood's weary soldiers. Taken by surprise at the sight of fresh reinforcements, the Confederate troops retreat in utter disarray. In a moment of urgency, Hardee calls upon Liddell's Arkansas veterans, the very brigade that initiated the battle. While issuing commands to Liddell, Hardee instructs him to direct his men to the most intense fighting, a task complicated by the dimming light. After their earlier engagement at Peters Hill, Liddell's troops have primarily observed the afternoon's conflict. However, as dusk approaches, it is now their opportunity to re-enter the fray. As the Arkansans move forward, visibility diminishes in the gathering darkness. Unbeknownst to them, they advance to within 30 yards of Gooding's brigade. Uncertain of what lies ahead, Liddell refrains from firing. At that moment, Polk arrives and decides to scout the situation for Liddell. As he moves forward, he unexpectedly finds himself amidst Gooding's Federal line. Thinking quickly, Polk takes charge and instructs the 22nd Indiana to hold their fire. Although they receive orders from an unfamiliar officer, the Hoosiers comply. Once the situation becomes clear, Polk hastily returns to Liddell's line and commands the Arkansans to fire directly ahead, resulting in devastating consequences for the bewildered 22nd Indiana and injuring Gooding in the process. Startled by the sudden onslaught, the 22nd Indiana retreats, leaving behind numerous casualties. It is only after the battle that the Hoosiers fully comprehend the extent of their losses. Upon tallying the numbers, the 22nd Indiana suffered 195 casualties, representing 65.3% of their strength in just a few minutes. Following the disintegration of the 22nd Indiana and the injury of Gooding, the remainder of the brigade retreats under the onslaught of Liddell's forces. As Liddell presses forward, he is convinced that he has secured the battlefield for the Confederacy and achieved victory. However, just as his troops advance, jubilant shouts can be heard from the intersection, heralding the arrival of Steedman's fresh Federal brigade, dispatched to fill the void left by Gooding's demoralized soldiers. Resolute in his intent to conclude the engagement decisively, Liddell readies his men to confront these reinforcements. Nevertheless, having witnessed the tumultuous clash with Gooding's troops, Polk decides that enough is enough for the day. With darkness descending and visibility reduced to mere feet, Polk instructs Liddell to withdraw, allowing him the opportunity to seize the Dixville crossroads. Thus, as the moon reaches its zenith over the battlefield on October 8, 1862, the Battle of Perryville draws to a close. Once the gunfire ceases, the grim toll of the conflict becomes apparent under the bright moonlight. Thousands of soldiers, both wounded and deceased, lie scattered across the field, predominantly around the formal Federal left flank atop the open knoll where Terrell had maintained his position that afternoon. As the last shots are fired, the tumult of explosions that had engulfed the area around Perryville gives way to the anguished cries of the wounded, who desperately call for assistance to alleviate their suffering. Ultimately, after a day-long confrontation on the hills west of Perryville, the Federals incurred a casualty rate of 7% among the 55,000 troops present, although only about 22,000 were actively engaged. In contrast, the Confederates, numbering 18,000, just over half of Bragg's army, sustained a casualty rate of 21%. The Battle of Perryville, with a total of 7,600 casualties, stands as the largest engagement ever fought in Kentucky during the war. 2 decades later, Private Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee reflected on the event, stating, "I cannot recount even half, nor can I fully remember at this late date the scenes of blood and suffering that I witnessed on the battlefield at Perryville." Despite the significant toll, both armies remained on the field, a situation that deeply troubled General Bragg. Although his forces had pushed the enemy back nearly a mile and inflicted considerable damage, the Federal troops showed no inclination to withdraw. If Bragg's men had achieved a significant victory, why did the Federals continue to hold their ground? As time progressed, the general began to understand the reality of the situation. He received reports from his cavalry indicating that he was actually confronting the entirety of Buell's army rather than just a single isolated corps as he had previously believed. Moreover, a fresh Federal corps, previously unseen, now posed a threat to his left flank as he contemplated retreat. While Bragg's forces had secured a tactical victory, 2 additional battles awaited them in Perryville against the remainder of Buell's army the following day. Upon grasping the full scope of the challenges facing his weary troops, Bragg concluded that the most prudent decision was to retreat and join forces with Smith in Lexington. With unanimous agreement among his subordinates, the Army of Mississippi departs from Perryville at dawn on October 9th. Concerned about the safety of his forces with the Federals positioned nearby, Bragg is relieved to find that Buell is willing to remain on the field, allowing the Confederates to withdraw. Following their exit from Perryville, the rebels make a brief connection with Smith in Harrisburg on October 10th. However, as the sluggish Army of the Ohio begins to mobilize, Bragg grows anxious about the possibility of being encircled and retreats further east. Although both armies are now evenly matched in numbers, Buell is determined not to provide Bragg with another opportunity to catch him off guard. Compounding the challenges faced by the Confederates in Kentucky, troubling news arrives from Corinth regarding Van Dorn's defeat at the hands of Rosecrans. Acknowledging that no reinforcements will be forthcoming from Mississippi, Bragg starts to contemplate the possibility of abandoning the Bluegrass State entirely. With no imminent battles, deteriorating weather conditions, and diminishing supplies, the Army of Mississippi finds it increasingly difficult to sustain its presence in enemy territory. Ultimately, the decline of Confederate aspirations in Kentucky is significantly influenced by the attitudes of the Kentuckians themselves. After several weeks of traversing the state, Bragg observes that the local populace is notably indifferent and lacks genuine enthusiasm for liberating their state from federal authority. Taking all these factors into account, Bragg makes the decisive choice to terminate his invasion of Kentucky on October 12th. In the coming week, the despondent Confederate forces make their way back to Knoxville, permitting the Federal troops to reestablish their dominance over the Bluegrass State. Throughout the remainder of the conflict, the Confederates will not pose a significant threat to Federal authority in Kentucky again. In stark contrast to their triumphant advance north just a month earlier, the Confederates, from the highest ranks to the lowest, returned to Tennessee filled with anger towards their commander. This discontent leads a group of officers opposed to Bragg to submit a petition to President Davis, urging the removal of Bragg from command in favor of General Joseph E. Johnston. However, after a meeting with Bragg, the president opts to retain him in his role, as Bragg expresses his determination to liberate Middle Tennessee. With his command temporarily secure, Bragg directs his army to Chattanooga to initiate preparations for an offensive against Nashville. This decision incites the anti-Bragg faction to the extent that they vow to openly challenge every order issued by Bragg for the duration of their service. Meanwhile, Buell, like Bragg, encounters his own political challenges following the Confederate incursion into Kentucky, particularly due to his inadequate performance at the Battle of Perryville. Although his forces managed to halt the Confederate advance at Perryville, the Federals can only claim a strategic victory as they ultimately compel Bragg to retreat, thereby maintaining their control over the Bluegrass State. Having ceased his pursuit of the retreating Confederates, Buell redirects his army back to Nashville, suspecting that this would be Bragg's next target. However, in a bid to liberate pro-Union East Tennessee, Lincoln instructs Buell to advance towards Knoxville instead. Unwilling to navigate the challenging terrain of East Tennessee, Buell outright declines to follow the order. Upon receiving Buell's refusal, the president relieves him of his command and appoints Major General William S. Rosecrans, the victor of Iuka in 2 Corinth, as his replacement. However, just as Lincoln believed he had found a commander who would adhere to orders, Rosecrans chooses to follow Buell's strategy for Nashville and instructs the army to advance towards the state capital to confront Bragg, who was advancing northwest from Chattanooga, precisely as Buell had anticipated. Months later, after the two armies have clashed near the small town of Perryville in central Kentucky, they are once again on the move, with Rosecrans heading south from Nashville and Bragg moving north from Chattanooga. As both armies progress, they are destined to meet in the cold, damp conditions of December, this time at Stones River, near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. If you find this narratives good, please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting histories.